First, actually, I'll introduce myself. My name is Roni Zeiger. I'm Chief Health Strategist at Google, and I've been at Google for about 4.5 years, working on various of our health projects. I'm a physician by background, turned just know enough about information technology to cause a little bit of trouble. And to get a better sense of the background of you all, raise of hands of folks who are explicitly in the health space. Okay, great. All right, terrific. So we're going to talk today about health and why Google is in the health space, and then specifically about the mobile context, which I think is of interest to you all if you read the title. So first, why health? Why explicitly health? So Google has been in the health space probably since its first week. Whether we explicitly do anything about health or not, an impressive number of questions that Google gets asked are about health. You can find a lot of different flavors of a similar chart, but, and this has nothing to do with Google, this has to do with the internet. People go to the internet to ask their health questions more than anywhere else. And it actually gets me up early every day to think about the fact that Google is answering more health questions probably than all doctors in the world on any given day. And that's a pretty huge responsibility. We do a lot of the work that I do is on search quality in the health space. We do some things that are specific to health. A lot of things we do, of course, are very generic. And so I just want to walk you through a couple of examples. For all of you who like to multitask, I know I do, feel free to try these yourself. These should, with one exception, these are all live. So if you do a drug search or a disease search, we put a special search feature at the top, in this case to get you directly to NIH-sourced information about really common things that people search for. So one of the most common things that people are looking for when they search for medications is side effects. And this takes you to that section of the page on NIH. About half a year ago, I got an email forwarded to me from a colleague, which was from a mom who said, "Hi Google, this morning my daughter swallowed something which I'm pretty sure was poisonous, and I went straight to Google and typed in the query poison control phone number. And it was really hard to find the number. This was a pretty terrible experience, and feeling panicked made it even more difficult to find the information I was looking for. I found out later that there's one number for the whole US, and you guys could do a better job in helping me find it." So we got a little smarter about that situation. Queries related to poisonings now search that information. And right after we did that, a bunch of colleagues at Google said, this might be even more impactful if we did it for an area that, unfortunately my life has been touched by because of a dear friend or similar. And we work with a lot of in the US, we work with the National Suicide Prevention folks and do something similar for suicide-related queries. So I think that's a good example of probably a very small volume of impact, but a reminder of how important some of the information needs are that people have and that they bring to places like Google. This is the one that's not live because flu season is quiet for now. We also have done some work with flu, some of you may know about. I'll tell you in a second about flu trends. And when flu season comes back, we'll bring this back up. It's a collaboration with Health and Human Services. And we collected from both public and private sources information about pharmacies and clinics and other locations that are collecting, that were giving out flu shots. This past season, as you know, was particularly stressful. There was a lot in the news. A lot of people were concerned. And people were having trouble finding locations that had seasonal and H1N1 flu in stock, or even understanding what the difference was. So we created essentially a Google mashup ourselves and put it on google.com/flushot, and we'll do the same this coming flu season. Our interest in flu actually started with a project that's technically a lot more interesting. A couple of our engineers thought that they might be able to estimate real-time flu activity in a location, whether it's a country or a region, by studying search queries. many of us were doubtful that it could be done, and it turns out they were right. The graph that you're seeing here in orange is CDC data that they collect from laboratories and Sentinel doctors' offices. And in blue is the data inferred by Google Food Trends only from how people are searching. And this isn't predicting. This is estimating in near real time. So we usually run our analyses overnight. And in the US, we did this work with the CDC, and it takes them about 2 weeks to collect and publish their data. So we're following with them, but about a week or two ahead of them in near real time. And this is now live in, I think, 28 countries, some of which have public surveillance systems, some of which don't. And the hope is that this serves as a useful complement to the more traditional health surveillance systems. In the US in particular, we've gone down to the city level because there's a lot of data. There's a lot of search traffic that we can analyze that's geocoded. And in some countries, it's just the whole country. In some, it's regions or states. In the US, it's cities. This is a really neat tool to play with and an interesting proof of concept. So that gives you a sense of the variety of things that we think about in the health space. And really, it's all about health information being one of the most important, in some of our opinions, the most important example of information when you talk about Google's mission of organizing the world's information and making it universally accessible and useful. So why mobile in health? Well, health is mobile. Probably much less than 1% of your time interacting with, engaging with, producing your health is spent in the doctor's office or in the institution. I've talked, and probably many of you have thought and talked and heard folks discuss the need to put the patient at the center. And we talk about this a lot in terms of really a human and patient-centered way of thinking about healthcare, where the patient is in the center and not just sort of a fan watching his or her healthcare process progress through insurers and doctors' offices and pharmacies, et cetera. And philosophically, I really strongly agree with that. But I think there's a practical aspect of that that's arguably even more important. The patient is at the center not just because it's important for us to consider that and to practice and support real patient-centered healthcare, but she's got all the data. I'm producing data right now. All of us are. Some of us are and aren't recording, and I happen to have 2 recording devices on me right now that we'll talk about in a few minutes. But this is where the action is. And the market is certainly paying attention. So there are a variety of fascinating devices and mobile applications, probably 10 new ones since this morning at the rate things are going right now. Some of them will be very successful. Some require you to put a device on, maybe wear it all the time. Others really use the fact that probably, maybe with 0 exceptions, every single one of you is wearing one of those devices right now, namely your mobile phone. So I'd like to drill into just 2 of them for the sake of an example, and then talk about some specifics. So these are 2 that I just think happen to be neat. All of the ones that I put up there I think have really terrific aspects to them that we can learn from. This one is an application called Cardio Trainer, which takes advantage of the fact that an Android device, like iPhones and several others, have accelerometers and GPS sensors, and lets you track workouts, combine them with music, map them, share them, and puts a lot of the fun and puts a lot of additional aspects of fun into exercise. And I think that a lot of people are being motivated by this. And I think this is one of the neatest aspects of the marriage here between technology, and in particular mobile technology, and health, is all of the questions it raises and maybe begins to answer about the behavioral aspects of health. And when it really comes down to it, the most important things we need to do in health do have to do with behavior change. The other example here is an application actually that a Googler developed called MyTracks. And it's very similar but optimized for the cyclist. And here's elevation of this particular cycling track. Now, I think a lot of the examples that we just saw, and many more that you all probably know about, are really terrific. And in many ways, they are silos. Most of them are beginning to think about what are they going to do to open up the data so that it really can, so that the user who's creating the data can do anything they want with it. And some of those have or are in the process of integrating with Google Health. So we have an open API, as I'm sure you're well. It's a GData-based API. For those of you who've worked with the Google Calendar API or several of the others. And here's a medical example. So this data could have come from Quest Diagnostics, which was mentioned in the previous talk. It could have come from a hospital laboratory, or it could have been entered, hand-entered by the user. Could have come if it were a glucose instead of a hemoglobin A1C. It could have come from a glucometer. And what we're doing with health is creating a home, a dashboard, if you will, for really any kind of measurement. And I want to challenge us to think beyond the traditional notion of tests, and think more broadly about what measurements can be. And in this case, we have a hemoglobin A1C. For you health geeks, know that 7 is probably in most people's degree is a pretty good goal. So here, that goal is explicitly set to 7, and the user can change that, and can see how in this case she is doing with respect to that. Now, there's no reason that has to be a medical thing. So here's weight, where we also let the user say what their height is and calculate their BMI for them. But this could be height, weight, glucose, blood pressure, mood, distance, cups of coffee, etc. And each of us can define in different ways. Maybe some of us will take cues from others, but each of us can define in different ways what's important about health, what we want to learn, what we want to track, what our goals are, how measurement 1 compares to measurement 2, and even start to generate hypotheses on our own or from friends that we wish to share with. One of the directions that we're heading in with Google Health, this is a screenshot of a version which will be coming out later this year, is how to put all of this in one place in a dashboard that lets you focus on your wellness information, for example, and you can use it just for that. But you can also have the sort of just-in-case kind of information, like your list of medications that you want to make sure is accessible to you should you end up in the emergency room, or maybe the list of your dad's medications because you help take care of him. And when you get that call, that might be pretty scary. There's one place that you can relatively quickly and safely go to get that. So, oops, didn't want to show you that yet. Mobile is everywhere. And the thing that I like most about the concept of mobile and health is how passive it can be. So I'm a fan of Fitbit. I wear one, and I almost always remember to take it. My flower it's actually kind of wimpy today. It hasn't been a great day. My daughter will not be impressed. But there are days when I forget it. I can't get very far if I don't take this. I'll actually go back home and get my phone these days, given how much I depend on it. And this actually has a whole bunch of sensors. And there are clever people doing really neat things with obvious measurements, like using the accelerometer, and thinking of all kinds of things that you can begin to measure when you start to think about the fact that this has ears and eyes, and who knows, maybe it'll soon have a nose, and it has location, etc. There's a researcher who I recently met who has a project called Asmapolis. You can look it up, and what he's done is he's produced sensors that go on inhalers for people who have asthma. And the data that he's collecting from people who've decided they'd like to use this and contribute their data, this is the first ever map of where and when people are having asthma symptoms. We've never had that before. It sounds almost trivial, right? But this is actually very interesting and potentially valuable information with which we could learn about asthma triggers for individuals and populations in general. And technically now, this is almost a trivial thing to do. So the last thing that I want to formally show you before having a discussion with you all, a more open-ended discussion, is a project that's totally unofficial, as you can tell. Some of you may have heard about 20% time at Google. We're encouraged to take a chunk of our time, engineers in particular, to experiment with things. Really look for the places where our passion can intersect with our work. And some of the neatest ideas, Gmail is a good example, come from that. So I'll show you a couple of different pictures in a second. But there's an Android phone in that envelope, and there's also this is Scotch tape. It's a very sophisticated design. And this is one of the bikes in a room in the gym where I take a spin class. So we were chatting one day, and frustrated with the fact that the little computer on the bike does a fine job of doing some basic calculations, but I can't take the data, I can't export it or grab it in any way. So we started thinking, this thing has a magnet in it, and this bike has a lot of metal on it. So one of our engineers and one of our summer engineering interns put this together. I dared them to get it done before this conference, and they did. And so there's using the magnet sensor, which is easy to programmatically access. Started looking at the magnetic fields created by the pedals going by, and created this very expensive cradle for the device, and then played with a couple of different peak detection algorithms, and we're able to do a pretty good job of figuring out what the RPMs are, the cadence of the bike. Now, this is not the first time someone has measured RPMs, but what we did with relatively little work, with a couple of different open platforms, is so what you do. Here's a closer picture of this is Akiva on the bike, and he signed in as Akiva 2, and he names his class, and it shows him in real time. He doesn't really need. You can't see. Oh, it's not projecting well at all. Wow, that's terrible. So here it says, here's the envelope. Here's the Scotch tape. Here's the Android device showing through the envelope. It's just so that you can see it. It's not required for it to operate, obviously. He signed in as he entered his name, Akiva 2, and the name of his class, which he called My Class, and it's displaying that at the moment that I took this picture, he was going about 74 spins per second. And then put together, you can tell a huge amount of attention to the UI, put together an App Engine app, which for anyone who's said that they're, in this case, for anyone who claims that they're in my class and says what their name is, we show their current RPMs and an arbitrary conversion from RPMs to points. Actually, all the top 7 of those are all bots. Those are fake people. But that's really Akiva's data. And then we have the class's average RPM and a couple of different timers you can use to maybe do little exercises in class. This actually was born by the fact that I was watching my spin teacher watch all of our legs to estimate if some people were going too fast or too slow. And that seemed like a silly thing. So I'm not sure what, if anything, we'll do with this. For now, it's just something we're playing with internally. But I thought it was a really nice example, which is why I suggested that maybe they'd do it so that I could share it with you all. Really nice example of all the innovation that's possible. The asthma example, to me, is actually the most beautiful one that I've seen so far, of something that's something of a no-brainer. Fits right into the workflow. All you have to do is sort of decide once I want to do it. You stick in the sensor into your inhaler and say, yes, please, I'm happy to share my data. And all of a sudden, this data starts populating a map, which could be really useful for people. Certainly really interesting and thought-provoking. And we're now, almost by necessity, carrying around a whole bunch of sensors. health is mobile. Health is, I'm exuding my health right now. I'm making explicit and implicit decisions, and many or most of those are measurable. And what we can do with all that information, what we can let people do if they want to, both individually and in aggregate, I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface of. And I hope that you will help us do a lot of interesting things in that area. I'll pause there and look forward to taking a bunch of your questions. Please.
Okay, I've got a little crazy one. You started out with the poison control center giving a phone number. Now, if you go on 3 years ago, going on to Google and asking for the phone number of a particular doctor in Portland, you got the back line. And as opposed to the 24-hour, there's somebody who will answer it all of the time. If someone had used Google to try and get a hold of that doctor in an emergency, they would have gotten no answer. And it was very difficult to correct. I received a sample of 40 primary care doctors in Portland and found 3 that were either their back line, a disconnected number, or some totally unrelated business. Now, it's very difficult to maintain a database of millions of phone numbers in the country, but at least for health and critical care and emergency numbers, it would be nice if Google would make a little bit of extra effort to correct that, and a little bit of extra effort to set up an interface for people to correct those emergency numbers.
I agree, and I appreciate the suggestions. For those folks who didn't hear, it was really about clearly having an updated phone numbers of various kinds is a very challenging thing to do for the entire world. We have ways that we try to provide tools to make that easier. In health, perhaps we should take extra efforts to make that work, and I agree, and I appreciate the suggestion. Please.
What was that device you had on your belt?
This is a Fitbit.
What?
It's called a Fitbit. One word. And it's it measures, uses an accelerometer to measure how much exercise, walking, running I'm doing. It also, if you wear it at night, uses same data, slightly different algorithms to guess how much you're sleeping. Actually, it gets a whole bunch of different things, but yeah. Bases it primarily on motion. Yeah.
So I noticed you're putting the patient in the center of the data, where they control their own data. Have you guys made much progress or working on trying to get that data to primary care physicians and transmitting it out? I mean, that seems like it's a lot easier to get it to the patient than allow the patient to give it to the different networks because they're so unconnected.
Yeah, so the question is about, are we working to not only get the data to the patient, but help the patient get the data, say, to her primary care doctor? So I'll answer in just a moment. I've seen in a couple of different countries that are in some ways much less technically developed than we are here. Their model is, here's the paper record, you're the patient, please take it to your next appointment. And the patients treat it like gold and pretty much always show up with it. I think it's an important metaphor that's taken literally in that case. So, yes, I think there's a lot more to do. What we've done so far is we've made it easy for someone to share with an individual if that individual has an email address. So you can share, we don't know who's a doctor, but you can share with Dr. Jones at gmail.com or my brother at yahoo.com, right? In addition, we've worked to make pretty intuitive printable versions that are maybe just the wallet size one or the full one that you could print out at any time. Even better is to be able to programmatically say, I found my doctor's practice here and I'd like to just press share and it just works. Unfortunately, that of course takes work on the doctor's side, and the doctor has. So we have pretty easy to use APIs, but of course the doctor has to have a system that's online. And that he or she can control or can delegate to someone, yes, please. I'd like to be hooked in to be able to get data from Google Health or elsewhere. What I think we'll see in X amount of time, I don't know what X is that the relevant folks who are doing the right things with health records, whether it's MedSphere or many others, they'll have a easy to turn on option that says, oh, well, if in your practice you'd like to accept data from Google Health and Microsoft Health Vault and Dossier and Y or Z, we've already built our system to connect to their API, so you just have to decide to turn it on. And that's a workflow decision for you. We're not there yet. Yeah. Please.
Is Google being able to invite people to develop mobile health apps on Android? Like to make that easier inviting?
So we're getting there. I think that Android is just exploding. It's been really fun to watch as a fan, as a user, and a little bit of an insider. We're looking a lot more closely at health, and I think you'll see a lot more coming then. We don't have an explicit landing page for here are cool health things. Maybe we should have one. And I'm very interested in maybe afterwards you can tell me if you have specific suggestions on how that would work. We are collaborating with some folks for the upcoming Health 2.0 conference in San Francisco in the fall, and we'll be participating in some of the related hackathons that are going on there, and I suspect that some of those will definitely be Android related. I think the opportunity there is just tremendous. Yeah.
Not to harp on what you're sharing, but as far as getting the information to researchers, a lot of researchers want to make use of the identified data to say someone who has access to their health on Google and says, sure, I'd like to, much like a donor on a license, or on a driver's license, can say just give my information to anyone as long as it's de-identified. Is that something that you're thinking about?
Yeah, I think so the question is about allowing Google Health users to donate their data to research, right, if you will. So what's possible today is that any research shop, the Mayo Clinic or the local county hospitals researchers can say, okay, we want to have a research program. Here's our site where we would be willing to collect the identified data. We've now written to the Google Health API. We show up in the directory of things that Google Health users can choose to interact with, and they might say, yes, I'll send my data. And if the user wants to and the researchers there will do it. We don't today have an explicit press here to just donate your data to anyone who says they're a researcher. Complicated for a lot of understandable reasons. And I think one of the challenges in this space is that we're still, the royal we, I think we're still really growing up to understand what are the important privacy issues, how can we address them proactively so that everyone really understands what this means and can do the things they want to do. In some cases, I remember back the first time I made a banking transaction online or put my credit card in, first time I was like, gosh, I'm not sure if I want to do this. And probably by the second or third time, I was like, I will never go into a bank again, right? Or God forbid I have to go into shop for clothes. My wife bought this jacket, and the key there is not that one of those sites convinced me that they are so good about privacy or security. That's of course important, but that's not what happened. What happened is that I saw the value of what I was getting with that transaction. In that case, amazing convenience and time saving. I don't think we figured that out in health yet. And so while of course we have a lot of work to continue doing on the privacy and security front that has to continue to be top of mind, I think one of the things that we aren't thinking enough about in that particular context is to do an even better job of communicating what the value is, so that when people make their explicit or implicit decisions of what they're willing to do, they understand what they're getting. And I think eventually that's where we'll get. Privacy and security will continue to get better implemented and better communicated, but I actually think even more important is that value will get better implemented and communicated.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So one of the themes of the conference so far has been, how do you have freedom in the cloud? That's something that's come up again and again. And I work with Sean Nolan from Microsoft, ironically, on one of the most important projects that's coming up is the InHIN Direct project. And Sean has been awesome on that project, and I really respect him. But in a previous life, Sean and I had some conflict. And the reason we had conflict is that HealthVault promised to release their specification for the HealthVault API under what's known as the Microsoft Open Specification Promise. How many people know what that means when I say that? It means that someone else can re-implement the API in a reasonable way. And they promised this, and then several years later, they released it under the Community Promise, which says something very different. The Community Promise says, if you implement it in a slightly different way, which specifically actually mentioned that if you implement it in a way that doctors have access to your PHR system in the sky, then we can go after you with the patents. You have to do it exactly the way HealthVault does it under the Community Promise. This is not true of the Open Specification Promise. But what they actually use says you have to do exactly the same way HealthVault does it. Oh, and Microsoft decides whether or not you actually did it the way HealthVault did it. And I think the InHIN and these kinds of things are great because it's going to give us, as you said, a generalized way to move data around. It's going to be really cool, but the Google API is really the way that you will expose the rich and exciting things that Google does. But how is Microsoft going to address this issue? Because from my perspective, I don't want to tell, and I'm actually doing some of the same kind of things where it's like cool, mobile device, gather some data, throw it up in the cloud. Ooh, that's awesome. But I want that data to be available in 50 years. And while I'm confident that you'll be around in 5, I'm not confident that you'll be around in 50 years. So how do you assure me, and just people who care about software freedom generally, that if you stop offering your API, I'm free to go implement it and I'm not going to get sued by someone who inherits your patents or something like that?
Yeah. So that question is over my head so I'm not enough of an open source, I'm not an open source expert at all to know the details of how we, I know a lot of our code, probably 1 out of every 10 lines of our code is open source or ends up being open source. I don't know enough about the legal aspects of how we release that and in what case, and in what senses can you reproduce what we've done. I think that from a sort of policy or philosophical basis, I think that we strive to be as open as we can. I suspect that we're not as open as you're suggesting is ideal, so that if tomorrow Google decides to shut its doors, that you can re-implement all of our services. Some of that's probably unrealistic. What we're obviously committed to is making sure that the data itself is liquid, that the APIs are incredibly well documented. Going that next step, if you will, to what you're suggesting of making sure that everything can be re-implemented I think is a terrific bar. I don't know enough about it to comment on how realistic or unrealistic it is. Extremely open to suggestions.
I'm sorry, you're asking for code escrow. What is normally called code escrow, right?
Oh, no, I mean,
he
it's ironic because
doesn't want the
Microsoft,
code, he just wants the legal right to be able to re-implement
the
it.
open specification code was created by Microsoft to handle the Samba issue. And in fact, that's where that stuff in Microsoft came from. Samba wanted to re-implement the Microsoft network protocol. And they created, and I think it was the European Union, forced them to create this promise that basically says, we won't go after you with our patents if we do this, right? Because that's what was required for the antitrust stuff. So Microsoft has this mechanism already set up, and thank you, Google, for not requiring us to have all these problems. We appreciate that. So Microsoft has all of these promises for how you say, you, open source community, are free to re-implement us. And then they said, for HealthVault, which of course is something that I, as an open source healthcare software developer, really want to take advantage of the services that Google and HealthVault have. They say, oh yes, it's going to be just like Samba. People will be able to create an open source re-implementation of HealthVault and do other cool things under the hood, but still talk like HealthVault does. And then they said, or not.
But I think there are a bunch of open source Google colleagues here, and I'll make sure that you get connected with someone so that we can get to see if there's anything we could be doing that we're not.
So when can I upload my 23andMe data to my Google Health record, and what's the rollout schedule for other medical record importation?
Sure. So tomorrow at 6 p.m. Just kidding. the 23andMe guys, I think, have a really neat service, and our API is ready for them. I hope that happens, and we do have the ability for, I believe you can download a text file of some subset of your 23andMe data, and and you can upload arbitrary files with some size limitations. In this case, it wouldn't be relevant to Google Health. To be clear, though, we don't quote unquote understand genomic data. You're not going to about to see a beautiful display of your chromosomes, however many you happen to have, but we let you use it as a place to store any of your health information. I think a really interesting challenge for us, both Google Health and all of us working in this space, is okay. Let's say that tomorrow 23andMe indeed turns on their Google Health integration. There's a lot of aspects of their information that our user interface doesn't really support. And while for any given example we can of course fix that, that's not a scalable approach. At some point there's going to be, okay, here's the basics of what we do in the health space, and then there's all this other innovation that must go much faster than we will. And I think probably what will end up happening is that there will be a service like 23andMe that lets you easily pull your data into a service like Google Health, and maybe there's a subset of it. Maybe some of the questions that you answered on one of their questionnaires that has to do with some of your allergy symptoms or similar you can easily interact with that data in Google Health. Then there's another aspect of it that's essentially just a file, and then you decide to share it with a researcher at another institution. We, Google, don't understand that data at all, but you've pulled that data in, and that researcher understands the 23andMe format, either because they're using an open standard, or they've communicated, or there's enough communication there to go on, and you've decided to use a service like Google Health as a hub for data sharing in that context. So a lot of really interesting challenges there. It's not as simple as my initial quip, but I do think that in the cases where you want something like that, you need to let all the folks know. The most common question I get is, when is my doctor's office going to help me do this? And the answer is, well, first of all, you got to let them know, and then what they need to do is let their EMR vendor or future EMR vendor know. Yeah. Hi.
Hi. Is the privacy policy for the personal data being stored in health records comparable to that of Gmail and other services, or is there, would you say it's more protected?
So it's we have a separate privacy policy. It uses we don't a little bit more modular for the general pieces of it. We use the core privacy policy, but some of the additional pieces are really about data ownership. So the deal we make with our Google Health users is that we won't use your data in any way, with one exception that I'll mention in a second, unless you specifically ask us to. So by specifically ask us, meaning you've asked us to share your data with the Cleveland Clinic on your behalf, right? That very, very explicitly. The exception that we call out in the privacy policy is that we are willing to, we haven't, but we are willing to in the future publish aggregated statistics. So for example, if 2 years from now we look back on the previous year and see that only 10% of people with documented heart failure have had a documented flu shot, and some of the experts that we collaborate with says that's actually really interesting and potentially useful information, and we understand that statistically there's no way that can be tied back to any individual. We sort of reserve the right to publish that, but other than that, we won't market, et cetera, your information.
So I'm not going to see custom AdSense ads for pharmaceuticals based on
No. And actually, a question that I'll have to admit that initially when we started Google Health, I was surprised to get, but clearly it's a very legitimate question. If I use Google Health, then when my neighbor or stranger searches on Google, will they find my health information? This crowd is kind of a geeky crowd and probably understands that that would be outrageous. So the answer is obviously not. The answer to your slightly more subtle question is that's correct. You won't see advertising. Well, first, there's no advertising on Google Health, but you also won't see advertising on search that's targeted to you based on your health information. Yeah. Implicit in your question is what's the business model? The business model is to provide something useful that will make people think about Google even more in the context of their health. That in turn makes people search more. And health, like any other of the popular verticals, is an important search vertical for us. It's just about, from the pure business perspective, which is not really why we started the project, but from a pure business perspective, it's just about search traffic. Yeah. Thanks.
I just pulled up Google Health to say there's one other exception also has applicable law. So if laws change, then...
That's right. So yeah, that's very important. So thank you. We're also subject to U.S. law. Yeah, and that's not a wild statement, but it also means that I don't, yeah. Turns out we're subject to the law, but no, but that's very relevant. Yeah. The law part? No comment. Yeah.
They're doing an acquisition.
Yeah. Any other questions?
A little more technical. This is a low ball. You can more easily knock this out of the park, I hope
Okay.
at least. CCR, CCD, what do you think?
Yes. So when we started, the question about CCR and CCD, when we started Google Health, we talked to the folks who were going to be our most likely initial dozen or so partners and asked them, what are you using? And about a third of them said CCR, none of them said CCD, and about 2/3 said, we don't know. We're not using anything. So we started with CCR, which I think was a good thing. It's a little simpler. It's easier to get your hands dirty with. We need to support CCD. One of the challenges is that this stuff is still a little bit of a moving target. And what we're finding as we watch the ecosystem interact with Google Health is that folks aren't waiting, and they are using subsets of CCR in ways that aren't perfectly consistent with the standard, but that actually work fine for the subset of data that they're using. And so I don't know what the answer is going to be, but I think that the world has gotten ahead of us a little bit and is a little bit more complicated than a standards committee saying this is what must happen. Now, of course, there's also legislative issues and stimulus funding that will be relevant to some aspect of the ecosystem. But notice that most of the things that we talked about here aren't going to be asking for stimulus funding anyway. So the answer is that we need to be smart about supporting data that's coming in those standards and that wants to be exhibited in those standards. I also think that's not going to be enough because there's going to be a lot of really valuable parts of this data ecosystem, if you will, that aren't going to be willing to deal with either of them. Yeah.
I actually had a related question, is that more discrete data that doesn't really fit into the CCR structure, things that you're going to get from devices, things that are more, I guess, kind of what Project Health Design uses, observations in daily living, things that are not quite as clinically defined and doesn't fit into this medical summary. Have you moved towards more discrete type of data collection? I mean, I know you guys were pretty solid on the CCR or a subset of CCR initially. Where are you guys thinking?
So we're thinking hard about how to be as agile as possible with that. What a lot of folks are doing, which works for us, is treating most of those measurements as tests, as far as CCR or CCD goes, for that matter, and that works just fine. We have to remember that the end user doesn't care about CCR or data formats for that matter, and so we have to make sure on both any of the user-facing aspects of it, on our application and applications that are connecting with ours, that's also being handled properly, so that it doesn't say results of your most recent blood tests and have your mood. Yeah, yeah. And the normal range for mood, right? Whatever that is. Yeah. Well, I'm happy to stick around for a little bit after, and thanks very much for your attention.